بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أعزائي الدارسين بالفرقة الدراسية الثالثة، كلية التجارة، جامعة القاهرة، مجموعة الدراسة باللغة الإنجليزية. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته، وأهلا ومرحبا بكم في هذا اللقاء الافتراضي الخامس الذي سوف أشرح لكم فيه الجزء الأول في الباب 17، وهو محاسبة تكاليف المراحل الإنتاجية حالة عدم وجود وحدات تحت التشغيل أول الفترة. قبل أن أبدأ أود أن ألفت نظر حضرات أبنائي وبناتي الطلاب إلى أن هذا الباب 17 سوف أقسمه إلى 4 أجزاء للتيسير ولسهولة الفهم والاستيعاب، ولذلك هذا الفيديو سوف نتحدث فيه عن الجزء الأول فقط من الباب 17 اللي هو المحاسبة عن تكاليف المراحل الإنتاجية. الجزء الأول اللي هو بنبتدي فيه نفهم الأول طبيعة هذا النظام، نظام المراحل الإنتاجية، ونبتدي نطبق مع بعض بمثال بسيط عملي على الحالة الأولى، وهي في حالة ما إذا كانت المنشأة ليس لديها وحدات تحت التشغيل أول الفترة. Hello dear students, this is my 5th online session in which I will explain the first part of chapter 17, that is process costing with no beginning work in process inventory. Learning objective number 1. At first, we will make a comparison of job costing and process costing systems. The comparison of job costing and process costing system. When making this comparison, we find that as for job costing, let us have a pointer. The first type of costing system is job costing systems. As you learned in chapter number 4, job costing systems are used to operations that have distinct identifiable units of a product or service. For example, custom-made machines, houses, shipbuilding. But as for the other costing type, which is process costing system, process costing systems are used to operations that have masses of identical or similar units of a product or service. For example, food, chemical processing, and so on. After you have studied job costing systems in chapter 4 and its refinement in chapter 5, You will study in this chapter process costing systems. Firms having homogeneous products that pass through a series of similar processes or departments use this process costing method. These firms usually engage in continuous mass production of a new similar products. Manufacturing costs, in this case, are accumulated in each process. The management accountant uses a production cost report to track production quantity and the cost information for each department. Unit product cost is calculated by dividing process costs in each department by the number of equivalent units produced during the period. The process costing system is used in many industries such as chemicals, oil refining, textiles, paints, rubber, steel, glass, food processing, mining, automobile production lines, electronics, plastics, drugs, paper, cement, and watches. Process costing system can also be used by service organizations with homogeneous services and repetitive processes such as check processing in a bank. Process costing system provides information for managers to analyze product and customer profitability and to make pricing, product mix, and process improvement decisions. In today's globally competitive environment, managers must know product costs to be able to make good decisions. Imagine a large corporation's top manager trying to decide whether to discontinue a product without knowing what it costs. You can imagine this case? Managers need cost information for setting goals, forming a strategy, developing long and short-term plans, and for control, performance measurement, and decision-making purposes. Imagine a large corporation's top manager trying to decide whether to discontinue a product without knowing what it costs. Process costing also allows accountants to determine unit costs needed for valuing inventory and the cost of goods sold for external financial reports. Sometimes process-based manufacturers have very different products going through different processes, making process costing by itself inadequate. In this case, activity-based costing is an important enhancement to process costing when product and process variety arises. For example, a company may use an activity-based costing type of process costing to help managers focus on the actual costs in each process and to reduce non-value added work in each process. In a job costing system, individual jobs use different quantities of resources. So it would be incorrect to cost each job at the same average production costs, as we said previously in chapter 4. In contrast, when identical or similar units of products or services are mass produced, process costing is used to calculate an average production cost for all units produced, as long as all the units are identical. In a process costing system, the unit of a product or service is obtained by assigning total costs to many identical or similar units of output. So the equation is unit cost equals total costs incurred, the total costs incurred divided by the number of units of output from the production process. Notice that each unit receives the same or similar amounts of direct materials costs, direct labor costs, and the manufacturing overhead. Learning objective number 2. Let us see the second step in our illustration now, which is understand the basic concepts of process costing and how to compute average unit costs. Process costing systems separate costs into cost categories according to the time when costs are introduced in the process. So the process costs are separated into two sections, two parts. The first one is direct materials. This separation is based on the time in which each cost item is produced. The second separate group include direct labor and overhead. These two both will be called later on as conversion costs. As for the direct materials, this group, direct materials are usually added at the beginning of the production process or at the start of work in a subsequent department down the assembly line. But as for the direct labor and overhead, which are called conversion costs, as I mentioned now, these two cost elements are generally added equally along the production process. The equivalent units. What do we mean by equivalent units? And how can it be calculated? A manufacturing firm typically has partially completed units, which is called work in process, at the end of an accounting period. Under the job costing system, these partially completed units are not difficult to handle because job costs are available on job cost sheets. But in a process costing system, however, costs for partially completed units are not readily available because the focus in cost accounting has shifted from jobs to processes or departments. The interest is in the unit cost of performing a certain process for a given period. The goal in process costing method is to find the combined unit cost of all product units processed in that period, including those that are partially complete at either the beginning or the end of the accounting period. Note that by partially complete, we mean partially complete for that department. That is, a unit could be complete for a given department, but still be in the work in process inventory for a department that follows in the sequence of manufacturing processes. With both complete and partially complete units, both of them, we need a way to measure the proper amount of production work performed during the period. An equivalent unit is the measure commonly used in this case. Equivalent units are the number of the same or similar complete units that could have been produced given the amount of work performed on both complete and partially completed units. Equivalent units are not the same as physical units. For example, suppose in a given month, a chemical company had in process 30,000 gallons of a chemical, of which 20,000 gallons only were complete at the end of the month, but the remaining 10,000 gallons were only 50% complete. So the equivalent units in this case would be 25,000 gallons. That is 20,000 plus the 10,000 times 50%. The percentage of completion is usually measured by percentage of total cost that has already been incurred in the production of the product. The equivalent units should be calculated separately for direct materials, direct labor, and factory overhead. Why? Because the proportion of the total work performed on the product units in the work in process inventories is not always the same for each cost element. Partially complete units are often complete for direct materials because we assume that direct materials are added at the beginning of the operation, but incomplete for direct labor and factory overhead. Examples include chemical processes that add direct materials at the beginning but are not complete until the completion of processing, which can extend over hours or days. So, because overhead is often applied on the basis of labor hours, some firms use the two categories, direct materials and conversion costs. Conversion costs are the sum of direct labor and factory overhead costs. Firms using non-labor-based cost drivers, such as machine hours or the number of setups, for their factory overhead costs, find that calculating separate equivalent units of production for factory overhead and direct labor costs is more appropriate. Look, it's important to notice that direct materials can be added at discrete points of continuously during the production. If the materials are added uniformly, the proportion used for computing equivalent units of direct materials is the same as the proportion for conversion costs, because they will be the same. However, if the materials are added all at once, the proportion used in the computation depends on whether the point in the process where the materials are added has been reached. To summarize, we say that, in summary, it can be said that when there are beginning or ending work in process inventories, we must estimate the percentage of completion of these unfinished units. These partially completed units must then be calculated in equivalent units of production. In order to accurately determine unit cost, the costs for the period must be divided by the equivalent units of production for the period. There will be separate equivalent unit calculations for materials and for conversion cost due to the fact that material is, as mentioned now, is typically introduced at the beginning of the process, whereas conversion costs are added uniformly throughout the process. Let us transfer now to learning objective number 3, in which we will illustrate allocating process costs via 5-step processes. The key document in a typical process costing system, the key document, is the production cost report, which is prepared at the end of each period for each production process or department. The production cost report summarizes the number of physical units and the number of equivalent units of a department, the costs incurred during the period, and the costs assigned to both units completed and units transferred out, and the ending work in process inventories. So 5 elements to be determined. The preparation of production cost report includes the 5 steps illustrated as follows. Allocating process costs through 5-step processes. We use 5-step process to allocate costs under process costing. First, we summarize the flow of physical units of output. Second, compute output in terms of equivalent units. Notice that in step number 1, summarizing of the flow is done by physical units, but in the step number 2, the computation of the output is done in terms of equivalent units. Thirdly, determine total costs of each manufacturing cost element. The total cost of direct materials, and the total cost of labor, and the total cost of manufacturing overhead. The 4th step is to compute cost per equivalent unit by dividing the total cost of each cost unit by the equivalent units of this cost item. And at last, assign total costs to units completed and to units in ending work in process, as we will see now. We will illustrate each step of these 5 steps in detail. As for the step number 1, which is summarizing the flow of physical units of output. This first step determines the number of units on hand in beginning work in process and the number of units started into production or received from a prior department. The number of units completed and the number of units in ending work in process inventory. The analysis of physical units includes accounting for both input and output units of the process. Input units include beginning work in process inventory and all units that enter a production department during an accounting period. But as for the output units, these include units that are complete and transferred out from a production department, and units in the ending work in process inventory. We will see this in detail in an example later on, soon. But let us now continue illustrating each step. As for step number 2, which is computing output in terms of equivalent units, not physical units, in equivalent units. The purpose of calculating equivalent units of production for direct materials and direct labor and factory overhead, the purpose is to measure the total work expended on production during an accounting period. The partially complete physical units are converted into the equivalent number of whole units. Step number 3, determining total costs for each manufacturing cost element. The total manufacturing costs for each cost element, materials, labor, and overhead, include the current costs incurred and the costs of the units in work in process beginning inventory, both of these two. The amount of these costs is obtained from material requisitions, labor time cards, and factory overhead allocation sheets. The total manufacturing costs for each cost element is also called total cost to account for. Total cost to account for. But the total cost determined in step 3 must agree with the total cost assigned in step 5, in the following step 5. As for step number 4, which is computing the cost per equivalent unit for each manufacturing cost element. We will compute the cost of unit under each of the 3 cost elements: direct materials, direct labor, and overhead. The purpose of computing direct materials and direct labor and the factory overhead costs per equivalent unit of production, the purpose is to have a proper product costing and income determination for an accounting period, which includes both complete and incomplete units. Finally, as for the step number 5, which we will assign total manufacturing costs to units completed and units at the ending period, which are work in process. The objective of the process, the objective of the production cost report is to assign total manufacturing costs incurred to the units completed during the period and the units that are still in process at the end of the period. The total costs assigned in this step number 5 should equal the total costs to be accounted for, which was mentioned in step number 3. Companies generally divide the 5-step production cost report into 3 parts. Part number 1 is for the production quantity information. Part 2 of this report is for the unit cost determination. And part 3 is for cost assignment. The first part of this report includes step 1, analyze flow of physical units, and step 2, which were calculate equivalent units. The second part includes step 3, which is determine total costs to account for, and step 4, which is computing equivalent unit costs. As for the third part of this report, it includes step number 5, which is assigning total manufacturing costs for completed units and transferred out, and work in process at the end of the period. So let us now, to make it more clear, have an example for each of these cases. We have 3 process costing cases. Let us look at the process costing process 3 ways. The first case is if we are not to have beginning or ending work in process inventory. If there were not any inventory at the beginning or at the end of the period. The second case, we will assume that we no beginning work in process inventory and some ending work in process inventory. In the second case, we will assume that we don't have beginning work in process inventory at the beginning of the period, but we have some ending work in process at the end of the period. Then we will see case number 3, in which we assume that we have both beginning and ending work in process inventory are present. Let us now see case number 1. Process costing case number 1. Assuming that we don't have beginning or ending work in process inventory. When using process costing without any beginning or ending work in process inventory, all costs that were incurred in the process during the period will be assigned to the finished units produced. All of the units will be finished units, as we don't have any units in process. Case number 2. No beginning and some ending work in process inventory. We assume that we don't have beginning inventory work in process, but we have some work in process inventory at the end of the period. We will give an example to illustrate this second case. Assuming that in January 2018, a company placed 400 units into production, and there is no beginning inventory of partially completed units at the beginning of the period. Not all units started, which were 400, not all of these units are completed by the end of the month. Only 175 units are completed. And what about the rest? The 225 partially completed at the end of January are fully processed for direct materials, because we assume that direct materials are added at the beginning of this process. But conversion costs, which consists of direct labor and manufacturing overhead, are added evenly during processing. Work in process ending degree of completion was 100% for direct materials, but 60% for conversion costs. Costs added during the current period are $32,000 for direct material and $18,600 for conversion costs. So if we apply the 5 steps mentioned before, as for step number 1, which is summarizing the flow of physical units of output. To summarize the flow of units, we have to mention work in process at the beginning of the period. In the second case, which we are dealing with now, we assumed that we don't have any partial units at the beginning of the period. So we put 0. Plus started units during current period, which were 400. So the total units under processing during the period amounts to 400. And this is called to account for, units to account for. Accounting for these units, we will find that 155 units of these 400 were completed and transferred out during the current period. But the rest of the 400, which are 225 units, these units are still under process until at the end of the period. About the completion percentage, these units are 100% for direct materials, but 60% for conversion costs. This is the first step which you will do it in solving any problem of process costing. To summarize the flow of physical units. After this step, let us go to the second step. The second step is computing output in terms of equivalent units. These completed units and these uncompleted units, we need to add both of these together, but addition will be in this manner incorrect, because these units are 100% completed, but as for the ending inventory, 225 units are not 100% completed for each cost items. So we have, in order to be added these to these units, we have to convert these under processing units to convert them into equivalent units, convert them to what they will equal completed units. This is the second step. Look now. We make a table, as you see. As for the second column, which consists of physical units, completed and transferred out units, 175. These are physical units, yes. And these units will be considered also as equivalent units because they are 100% completed. Okay. And as for the physical units also, we have at the end of the period work in process 225. Adding these completed units to these physical uncompleted units, we will have the total of the physical units to account for, which are 400. But these are physical units. We need to transfer or to convert these units into equivalent units. So let us have the conversion, the converting these units. Direct materials. As for the direct materials, the completed units equals 175, the same, because they are 100%, as you see the note now here, 100% for direct materials. But as for the work in process at the end of the period, they are 100% completed from the point of view of the direct materials, because we assumed that direct materials are added at the start of production. So the total units are equivalent. They equal 400 units equivalent from the point of view of direct materials. But let us now see what about the conversion costs, which includes direct labor and overhead. As for the completed units, they are 100% for all of the cost items. So they will be also 175. But as for the work in process, these units are uncompleted. They didn't receive all what they need from the labor or overhead. So these units received only 60% of the conversion costs. So the 225 physical units equal 135 units as a conversion costs. So the total number of units as for the conversion costs equals 310. So we can now say that in order to compute the cost per unit, from the direct materials, divide the total cost of direct material by the units which were used in it. But as for the conversion costs, the cost per unit will be computed by dividing the conversion costs by 310 units. So let us now go go to step number 3 and 4 and 5, which will be dealt in the cost report of the process. Calculating product costs, step number 3 and 4 and 5. We say that steps 3, 4, and 5 together are called, all of these steps are called the production cost worksheet. In step 3 of this report or of this worksheet, we summarize the total costs to account for. We have to accumulate the costs of each cost element, because the beginning balance of work in process is 0 on January 1 in this case. The total costs to account for consists only of costs added during January, which are $32,000 in direct materials, $18,600 in conversion costs, for making the total of $50,600. As for the step number 4, in step number 4, we calculate the cost per equivalent unit separately for the direct materials costs and conversion costs. This is done by dividing the direct material costs and equivalent and conversion costs by their related quantities of equivalent units of work done in January. In step number 5, we assign the total direct materials and the conversion costs to the units completed and to the units still in process at the end of that month, as will be shown in the following exhibit now. This is done by multiplying the equivalent output units of each input by the cost per equivalent unit. This is the process cost worksheet. As you see, this worksheet consists of 4 columns. The first column is for total production costs. The second is for equivalent units. And when dividing each total cost of each element by its relevant equivalent units, we will have the cost per unit from this cost element. As for the last column, it is for the physical units. This column shows the summarizing of physical units, which was done in the first step. Let us now see physical units, as mentioned in the example, were 400 units. This is the physically. Computing cost per equivalent unit. We now want to compute the cost per equivalent unit for each cost item. As for the direct materials, it is assumed to be $32,000. So to be written here. And the equivalent units, which was computed in step number 2, the equivalent units from the point of view of direct materials equals 400 units. So dividing the total cost of materials by its equivalent units, we will have the cost per unit of material equals $80. As for the conversion costs, which includes both direct labor and manufacturing overhead, we assumed this to be $80,600. These costs will be divided by the equivalent units from the point of view of conversion costs, which was calculated in step number 2. They are 310 equivalent units. Dividing these costs by the equivalent units of it, we will have cost per unit of the conversion costs equals $60. So the total cost of the equivalent units will be $80 plus $60, which equals $140. Yes. And the total manufacturing costs, which consists of direct materials and conversion costs, the total equals $50,600. These costs are called total costs to account for. This sum must equal the total of the second part of this worksheet. Now, we want, in the step number 5, we wanted to assign this total manufacturing costs, we want to assign this to the output of the process, which includes completed and transferred out units and uncompleted units at the end of the period. Assigning this to the two parts of the output. Assignment will be done by multiplying the cost of equivalent unit by each number of equivalent units of the completed or the uncompleted units, as we will see now. Assignment of costs, assignment of these total costs. These costs will be assigned to completed and transferred out units, first group. Then will be assigned also to uncompleted work in process at the end of the period. As for the completed and transferred out units, as these units are 100% completed from each of the cost items, so we can compute the cost of these units either by multiplying the equivalent units, the cost per each cost element separately, or it is better to calculate it by multiplying the total cost of the equivalent units by this number. And this what we will do now. The completed units are 175 units, which are complete from both direct materials and conversion costs. So we will multiply these units by the total cost per equivalent unit, as you see now. Multiplying these units by the total cost of the equivalent unit, we will have the total cost to be assigned to this section of units amounted to $24,500. And as you notice, as for the fourth column, which is summarizing the physical units, we begin by the input of physical units, which were 400 units, and then we are summarizing the flow, which these 400 units, 150 and 75 of these units were completed, and then we will also write the other part of these units, which are uncompleted units. As for the work in process at the end of the period, these units are not complete as for all the cost elements. They are completed from the point of view of materials, but uncompleted from the point of view of conversion costs. So we cannot calculate the cost of this second group by multiplying the total cost, total equivalent cost by these units. We must calculate this separately. We calculate this cost as for direct materials, then we will compute the cost as for the conversion cost separately. As for direct materials, these physical units equals 225 units, equivalent units, because as we mentioned before in step number 2, these units received all its needs of direct materials. So multiplying this number of equivalent units by the cost per equivalent unit of material, $80. So we will have $18,000. This means that the work in process at the end of the period will be assigned with $18,000 as for direct materials. But what about conversion costs? Conversion costs, these units are not completed. The equivalent units of this cost item equals 135 units, as was calculated in step number 2. Multiplying these equivalent units by the cost of the equivalent unit of the conversion cost, which amounts to $60, we will have the conversion costs to be assigned to this second part of the units equal $8,100. So the total cost assigned to work in process at the end of the period will amount to $26,100. Notice that costs assigned to completed units plus the costs assigned to uncompleted units, the total of both of these will equal the total cost to account for. So we write here the sum of these total equals $50,600 and named total costs accounted for. Here we say that costs to account for, but here we say accounted for. And now we came to the end of our virtual session about part 1 of chapter 17. As I mentioned at the beginning of this session, I divided this chapter into 4 parts. I'd like to thank you